How do you think an Iron Maiden worked? This is a genuine question. We've all seen them before in illustrations or games or movies, a sort of sarcophagus lined with spikes, a truly evil-looking piece of medieval machinery. But really, how does it work? It's usually categorized as a torture device, but any depiction of one seems like a closet that would just kill their victim almost instantly through shock and or blood loss. Kind of defeats the point of the big evil-looking torture mechanism. You're not supposed to think this hard about an Iron Maiden. You're supposed to see one, go, oh, geez, glad I don't live in the Middle Ages, and walk into the next room of the museum. They don't make sense, because historically, the Iron Maiden did not exist. There is exactly one written record describing such a device, and that record was effectively a tourism flyer written 200 years after the Iron Maiden was supposedly used. Although it's ubiquitously referred to as a medieval torture device, there is absolutely no physical evidence of one existing before the 1800s, a solid 300 years after the end of the medieval period. And, I should point out, they weren't used in the 1800s. Instead, they were fabricated as antiques and sold to uncritical museums and collectors who correctly assumed that such a brutal-looking piece would entice and excite visitors. Why? Because the Iron Maiden presents more than a simple shock piece. Instead, fictional or not, it fits into our favorite ongoing cultural narrative, that we are, in whatever the current year is, the least barbaric we have ever been, that for all our contemporary conflicts and foibles, at least we aren't like that. At least we didn't throw people in an Iron Maiden. In 1888, the state of New York created a commission to determine the most humane and practical method of carrying into effect the sentence of death in capital cases. This commission delivered a report nearly 100 pages long, covering not just their simple recommendation, but an exhaustive run-through of every method of execution they could find. The Iron Maiden has a section in this report, as does being buried alive, mauled by wild beasts, and lashed to the mouth of a cannon. Many sections, such as the Iron Maiden, are based on hearsay rather than historical record. But it's the section on hanging, a method with near-infinite history to pull from, that presents the Commission's most self-reflective moment. Quoting from a recent issue of Harper's Magazine, they write, "We are led to wonder if the time will ever arrive when the gallows shall be placed as a curiosity in museums, and sightseers shall flock to gaze upon it and marvel how a people who gave so much evidence of civilization and refinement as did their forefathers could have employed such a machine for the amelioration of the moral condition of mankind. Will posterity shudder at a model of a gallows set up in complete working order on a shelf, as we of today shudder when we examine the ancient instruments of torture collected in the old world museums? Will the American of the year of our Lord 2000 be so far in advance of us? We venture to hope so." The report absolutely nails our evolving moral relationship with the methods of this most extreme punishment. In the year 2000, many of us did shudder at the idea of the gallows. But what the Commission in 1888 can't see is the larger cycle, how we excuse the practices of today via the specter of previous barbarism. The 120 years since that report was written has seen consistent declarations that not only have we found a new solution to execution, but the old solution was brutish, crass, inhumane. This new solution always represents a new era, the most evolved, the most enlightened. That is, until it too is rendered barbaric by the next development in line. This is the narrative of capital punishment. In the United States, at least. From noose to electric chair to injection, each new method of execution has been introduced with the promise that it will do the impossible, take the life of an unwilling participant in a way that is gentle, clean, and enlightened. However, the reality of execution methods paints a different picture. Each successive approach to capital punishment does inform us about the era and culture that applied it, but not in a way that presents some linear arc towards utopian punishment. Instead, the modern history of execution demonstrates which aspects of criminal justice our institutions are interested in evolving and which barbaric elements the system preserves. Now, a little post-introduction preamble. Post-amble. The topic of this video is grisly. While I will not be showing any photos or videos of people experiencing the process of capital punishment, I will be describing events surrounding executions that are undeniably disturbing. If you want to avoid hearing, for example, the things that happen when a lethal injection is botched, I totally understand and suggest you find a different one of my videos to watch. I also suspect that YouTube will not allow this video to remain monetized or unrestricted for long. If you want to support this kind of essay, and I hope you do, because it really takes a lot of effort to put something like this together, I suggest signing up for Nebula, which provides a more stable home for work like this. On Nebula, you can also watch an additional video I made on this topic. More on that later. Finally, my discussion of capital punishment is generally not going to include the specifics of what crime landed any individual person on death row. All of that is easy enough to find if you so desire, but it's outside the scope of this essay. The longest chapter in the history of state executions indisputably belongs to hanging. The Odyssey includes hanging. The Book of Esther includes hanging. And while the basic equation of rope, noose, neck has remained basically unchanged, the social phenomenon of hanging has shifted to suit the whims of its time and place. The most basic, you could say primitive, version of hanging is what's present in the Odyssey. After slaughtering all the would-be suitors, Odysseus declares that the women of the house, who were insolent to him and his mother, don't deserve a clean death either. He takes the rope from his ship and strings the offending maids up, one after another. The story notes that the hanged women died most miserably, with their feet convulsing for a while. This slow, drawn-out death was sometimes the point. Odysseus takes care to say that the noose is an alternative to a clean death. Hanging was often a public spectacle, an act of punishment meant to be witnessed. In Michel Foucault's book Discipline and Punish, he writes that the public execution has a juridico-political function. Over and above the crime that has placed the sovereign in contempt, it deploys before all eyes an invincible force. Its aim is not so much as to re-establish a balance as to bring into play as its extreme point the dissymmetry between the subject who has dared violate the law and the all-powerful sovereign who displays his strength. The punishment is carried out in such a way as to give a spectacle not of measure, but of imbalance and excess. There must be an emphatic affirmation of power and its intrinsic superiority. Foucault is writing about more than hanging here. He begins the book with an agonizing account of a man partially pulled apart by horses, his dismemberment assisted by various executioners. But gallows are easily included in his analysis of public execution by the state. To see a murder carried out at a leisurely pace in front of a crowd was to recognize that the institution doing the killing is unquestionable. In this way, the looming shadow of the gallows and the slow death by strangulation are points in favor of hanging. Foucault says explicitly that this theater of terror was not a lingering hangover from an earlier age. It all serves a purpose. Its entire apparatus were inscribed in the political functioning of the penal system. Foucault was a French writer, and his theories on public execution largely drew from European examples. But it's not hard to transpose his analysis onto America's own iconic hangings. More specifically, its history of lynching. A campaign of terror perpetrated on Black Americans by white supremacists, the point of lynchings were to be public. Lynching was nominally against the law, but often done with the implied consent or even active participation of law enforcement, and the messaging was clear. White supremacy was the law, the invincible force that Foucault wrote about. In fact, even though any kind of public execution was, by the letter of the law, illegal in the United States, many southern towns in the early 20th century still held public hangings. These hangings were, by and large, a weak attempt to appease mobs of would-be lynchers. But the killings would have occurred with or without state cooperation. That's as clear an indication as any of who actually held the power to define legality and life. Although there were many methods of lynching, part of hanging's appeal was its staying power. The victims of lynching would be purposely left on display for long after their murder. The image of a tree made into an impromptu gallows still functions as iconography for white supremacist violence. Outside the American South, however, there were efforts to professionalize hanging, starting with the construction of purpose-made gallows and continuing through innovations in rope grade and fall height. A good or desirable hanging came to be understood as one in which the executed party's neck broke on the initial drop. A slower death by strangulation was the less desirable option. Executioners would occasionally boast of their talent in knowing exactly how far someone needed to fall based on their height, weight, and other factors. But for all the physics and calculations that could theoretically make hanging a less amateur method of killing, botched executions continued to happen. The fall wouldn't break a neck. Executioners would sometimes pull on people's feet in an attempt to hasten their asphyxiation, and occasionally the rope itself would snap, sending the would-be executionee tumbling to the ground alive. Other times, the initial fall would open wounds on the executed's neck or even cause, and I'm sorry to put this image in your head, partial or complete decapitation. Concurrent to these professionalization efforts, portions of the public were experiencing a significant cultural shift. As Austin Sarat, whose research I'm drawing from for much of this essay, writes, a new middle class that prided itself on etiquette and taste viewed the unruly mobs that attended public executions as base, vulgar. At the same time, hospitals became more common, and thus the experience of death shrank from everyday life. The idea of watching people executed by the state brought the recent horrors of the Civil War to mind. In short, it wasn't exciting to watch someone die anymore. Lynchings, the exception to this cultural shift, arguably happened because the mobs perpetrating them didn't see their victims as people at all. What's absent from these attitude changes is, you might notice, concern for the hanged themselves. The moral unease over public executions was largely focused on the corrupting influence of violence on spectators, not the painful and drawn-out deaths experienced by the people at the center of the event. And fittingly, just before the turn of the 20th century, new technology presented a solution to the problem of capital punishment. It was a bold, modern take on execution that would place the entire ordeal behind prison walls. It promised to do away with the residual barbarism that still haunted the gallows. In 1890, New York introduced the electric chair. 5 years earlier, David Bennett Hill, the mayor of New York, made this motive explicit. The present mode of executing criminals has come down to us from the Dark Ages, he said. It may well be questioned whether the science of the present day cannot provide a means for taking the life of such as condemned to die in a less barbarous manner. Science had, in a sense, already demonstrated an alternative method. 9 years before the electric chair was officially introduced, and 4 years before Bennett Hill's speech, a likely drunk dock worker wandered into the new electrical plant in Buffalo, New York. According to another worker, he yelled that he was going to stop the machine, put his hands directly on one of the generators, and was killed as a massive electric shock passed through his body. Electricity's early history features a significant amount of experimenting with its deadliness. The most notorious example might be the absurd killing of Topsy the elephant, but decades earlier, pioneers in the field of electrocution had convinced local animal control to use electricity as a more humane method of euthanasia. As New York sought a method of execution that matched the progress and etiquette of the modern era, the notion of using electricity seemed only appropriate. This is, in fact, the reason for that 1888 Commission on Humane Execution. After running down all the antiquated methods of capital punishment, the Commission concludes that the death produced by a sufficiently powerful electric current is the most rapid and humane produced by any agent at our command. Side note, for those familiar with the saga of direct versus alternating current, it will come as no surprise that Thomas Edison enthusiastically supported the invention of the electric chair. The chair ran on an alternating current, which Edison wanted to establish as the deadlier version of electricity. It's impossible to know what happened during history's first hanging, but for better or for worse, we know exactly what happened to William Kemmler, the first man executed via electric chair. Despite the promises of its inventors and the findings of New York's commission, the execution was neither rapid nor painless. Kemmler's death took a full 8 minutes. He did not die after the supposedly lethal first shock. He drooled, made noises, and his chest continued to move. The executioner threw the switch again, this time for a full minute. Kemmler's body began to smoke, and he gave off a foul smell. He did die, eventually. Not a promising start for the modern solution to capital punishment. But even though it initially failed to deliver a better death than hanging, the electric chair continued operation in New York and was subsequently adopted by many other states. It was in general less error-prone than its predecessor, with no analog to the slow secondary death of asphyxiation delivered by the gallows. However, when the electric chair faltered, it often did so in a way more grotesquely spectacular than what came before. In several cases up through the 21st century, the chair has caused its victims to smoke or even catch fire. In the case of Jesse Tefero in 1976, flames burst from around his head on each of the several shocks it took to ultimately kill him. In one of the most infamous uses of the electric chair, however, nothing about the procedure went wrong. The execution itself was notable because the person being killed was a woman. In 1928, New York executed Ruth Snyder, only the 6th woman to receive capital punishment in the 20th century. But Snyder's death wasn't simply immortalized for her gender. Rather, it was that a picture of her execution ran on the front page of the New York Daily News. The act of capturing the picture itself was an exciting bit of journalistic subterfuge. Tom Howard, a photographer from out of state, so the prison guards wouldn't recognize him, strapped an improvised camera to his heel, with the controls for the long exposure required connected to a bulb in his pocket. The resulting picture is blurry and almost impressionistic, but the abstraction only adds to the horror of it. Straps bind her arms and legs, her face is almost totally obscured by a mask and helmet, yet her eyes are still visible. The long exposure smears the edges of her body and the device she's fastened to. It feels as if you can see the electricity. It feels as if you're witnessing the moment of her death. It feels, through the clear hastiness, the near voyeuristic quality of the photo, like you're uncovering a new medieval torture device. And this picture ran on the front page of the Daily News, a very popular tabloid newspaper with a circulation of over 1 million, the first ever published photo of an electric chair in use. The headline is all caps, one word, exclamation point. Dead. In the very first case of execution by electric chair in 1890, Kemmler's attorneys argued that this new method constituted cruel and unusual punishment. He was sentenced to a mechanism of murder previously only used on animals, with no guarantee of an easy death. In response, the Supreme Court responded that in capital cases, the electric chair was the most humane and practical method known to modern science. The court stated that the punishment of death on its own is not cruel. Cruel and unusual as used in the Constitution implies something inhuman and barbarous. The electric chair enjoyed a long tenure, and over the past 120 years carried out more executions in the U.S. than any other method. But most of those executions happened before 1950. In the past 40 years, the electric chair has been part of less than 10% of America's capital punishments, and it's not the primary method of execution in any state. For many states, it took less than half a century for the chair to transform from the most humane and practical method to a relic that was, in fact, cruel and unusual. Its legacy, influenced by the stories of its explosive failures, now sits next to the noose. It's another old and brutal tool, reminiscent of a more primitive age. Like hanging, its changed reputation was partially due to the grisly notoriety the chair eventually earned. Like hanging, the change also happened because new machinery of death had since emerged. I would guess that most Americans are somewhat familiar with the electric chair or the gallows as a method of execution. The electric chair, in particular, has little legacy outside of individual capital punishments. The same can't be said of the innovation Nevada introduced in 1924, the gas chamber. Like the electric chair just 30 years before, the pitch for the gas chamber was one of painless, near-serene execution. The original idea was that the person sentenced to death could be gassed while sleeping in their own cell, an execution so gentle they wouldn't even know it took place. Even in the 20s, though, it was hard to shake the violent connotation of gas. Liquid chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas had all been used to terrifying effect in World War I, still held in recent cultural memory. And yet, in 1924, less than 6 years after the end of the war, a man on death row named Guy John breathed in hydrocyanic acid in a specially built room in Nevada and died. It took a little while for other states to catch up. Arizona built a gas chamber in 1930, and by the end of the decade, California, Missouri, Oregon, Wyoming, and my lovely home of North Carolina joined the trend. And yet the chamber, too, failed to fulfill its promise of a quick, easy death. In 1936, North Carolina's execution of Alan Foster via cyanide gas lasted several awful minutes, during which time Foster's body spasmed and his eyes showed obvious agony. One local professor wrote that the chamber was a pitiably brutal failure in the search for a more humane way of killing. Proportionally, the gas chamber was less successful at delivering a death properly than the chair or hanging. Over 5% of the deaths delivered by gas in the U.S. were botched in one way or another. You might assume, as I did, that this was because of the gas chamber's surely brief stint in the spotlight. After World War II, after the Holocaust, how could anyone view this as a humane, painless way to go? But you would be incorrect. Not only did gassings continue up through 1999, Maryland, Mississippi, and New Mexico all constructed their own chambers after the conclusion of World War II. It's not that the connection went unnoticed. At another botched gassing in 1967, protesters outside were met with the founder of the American Nazi Party, who held a sign that said "Gas, the only cure for black crime and red treason." To be honest, I have a hard time rationalizing how it's even possible the American gas chamber was used for as long as it was. It caused death slower than its predecessors, was more error-prone, and is inextricably tied to one of the most well-known genocides of all time. I can only find logic in the chamber in context of what it was succeeded by: lethal injection. The initial promise of the gas chamber was essentially a medicalized death. Rather than gravity, dismemberment, or the barely controlled force of electricity, why not approach death in a way that resembled, at least aesthetically, the same chemicals used in hospitals? Lethal injection's pitch was almost identical. And more than any execution method that came before it, lethal injection was a triumph of presentation. With a delivery no more horrifying than a blood test, and a death as easy as going to sleep, lethal injection seemed to fill the role the state had been searching for: an involuntary death absent of barbarism. Of course, the irony of a medicalized treatment meant to non-consensually kill a patient is clear as soon as you investigate who participates in these death sentences, or rather, who refuses. the American Medical Association, the American Nursing Association, the American College of Physicians, the American Public Health Association, all have denounced any medical professional taking part in the health-conscious theater of a lethal injection. Together, the association stated that when the healthcare professional serves in an execution under circumstances that mimic care, the healing purposes of health services and technology become distorted. This isn't even a new stance. Back in 1888, the commission searching for a humane method of execution identified the potential deadliness of lethal injection, but wrote that it so resembled the practice of medicine, it is hardly deemed advisable to urge its application for the purpose of legal executions against the almost unanimous protest of the medical profession. Remember, that's the commission that ultimately chose the chair. In addition to the people who refused to take part, the injection itself has, in a manner of speaking, attempted to abstain. Most states in the country initially adopted a 3-drug cocktail of sodium thiopental, pancuronium bromide, and potassium chloride. However, in 2011, Hospira, the primary provider of sodium thiopental, ceased production of the drug, in part because it couldn't otherwise stop states from using it for executions. Some states attempted to pivot to another drug, pentobarbital, for injections, but its manufacturer quickly blocked sales to death penalty states. If you're invested in finding the most humane method of killing a person, the actions of doctors and pharmaceutical companies might seem frustrating. With our history of crude and unsuccessful executions, aren't they standing in the way of the most promising option? But this perspective assumes an effectiveness onto lethal injection that it's never demonstrated. The promise of the original 3-drug blend was a sedate and painless experience for both the executed and any onlookers. Sodium thiopental would put the subject to sleep, pancuronium bromide would paralyze them, and finally potassium chloride would kill them by a cardiac arrest, stopping their heart. This combination was suggested by the chief medical examiner of Oklahoma, the first state in the country to make lethal injection their official method of execution. When other states followed Oklahoma's lead, they also followed its chemical formula. Simple imitation is how these 3 drugs became the de facto ingredients for lethal injection. What's missing from this history is the validation of the cocktail's ability to do what it promised. The selection of the lethal cocktail was done quickly and near randomly. Jay Chapman, Oklahoma's medical examiner, was not an anesthesiologist nor a toxicologist and chose an anesthetic and paralytic based on his own experience being anesthetized, a process that notably did not result in his death. Even at the time, Chapman admitted that he didn't do any research. Interviewed 30 years after he unwittingly chose the chemicals that would be used to kill over 1,000 people, he said, "I had absolutely no concept at the time. This business of lethal injection was a pure sidelight." I tell you all this to make sense of the fact that lethal injection has the highest botch rate of any execution thus far discussed, proportionally the most fuck-ups in the past 120 years. Over 7% of the state's attempts to carry out capital punishment with lethal injection have contained some failure of protocol or chemistry that has inevitably made the supposedly painless death into an excruciating sideshow. And despite the drug cocktail's contentious history, of which I've barely scratched the surface, many executions are botched before the chemicals are even introduced. Often the staff, who remember are typically not doctors or nurses, are unable to find a suitable vein. This search can, and has, gone on for hours. While the injection is intended to go into the arm, executions have been attempted with the IV running into an inmate's legs, their neck, or even their groin. Finding a vein is no guarantee of a successful application either. In 2006, Angel Diaz continued to live for over 30 minutes after he was injected with the drug cocktail. An autopsy revealed that executioners had shoved a needle all the way through his vein, and the drugs had instead flowed into soft tissue. The chemical burns on his arm were compared to a kid who had fallen into a campfire. A similar sequence of events happened with Clayton Lockett in 2014, when after a rushed hour of attempting to find a place to administer the injection, received a single IV supposedly connected to a vein in his groin, but through a failure of expertise and medical equipment on hand, the vein collapsed and drugs were once again pumped directly into his tissue. The breakdown of competent injection administration is only compounded by the wantonly chosen drugs being delivered. General anesthetic doesn't work if it's simply pushed into the meat of a body. Cardiac arrest doesn't immediately occur if the chemicals never reach the heart. But the most revealing piece of lethal injection is the middle ingredient in the cocktail, the paralytic. The Human Rights Watch notes, pancuronium bromide is a neuromuscular blocking agent that paralyzes all of a body's voluntary muscles, including the lungs and diaphragm. It does not affect consciousness, however, nor does it affect experience of pain. Without proper anesthesia, anyone given the drug will feel himself suffocating, but because the pancuronium bromide prevents any movement, speech, or facial expression, he will be unable to reveal that he is suffering. If the prisoner is still conscious when the potassium chloride is injected, the pancuronium bromide will also prevent him from conveying to the executioners or the witnesses that he is experiencing pain. As the Human Rights Watch then points out, the paralytic does not aid the anesthetic, nor quicken the cardiac arrest. Seemingly its only job is instead to improve the aesthetics of an execution for onlookers. In the event that a prisoner receives too little anesthetic, a relatively likely outcome given the lack of medical expertise, the potassium chloride that causes cardiac arrest would be agonizing. In the history of lethal injections, there are many cases of inmates convulsing as they died, absolutely looking like they suffered through their last breath. But because of the included paralytic, we have no idea the true number of executions that end in agony. Somehow, that cocktail might still represent a higher standard of lethal injection than what's been practiced over the past decade. As manufacturers have ceased production or barred sales of the original 3 drugs used, states have sought other options with the same level of research and care that originally defined the process. In fact, several states have left the drugs completely unstipulated in their policies, instead deferring to individual correction officials. As legal scholar Corinna Barrett-Lane writes, the culmination of these irregularities is a world where lethal injection drug protocols are decided by Google searches and other decision-making processes that would be patently unacceptable in any other area of administrative law. One such drug that states have turned to is the anesthetic midazolam, but doctors have pointed out that the effects of midazolam have significant variability between people. One person could require 10 times the dose of another. In 2021, John Marion Grant received a combination of drugs, including midazolam, from executioners in Oklahoma. He vomited several times after receiving the injection and didn't fall unconscious for 15 minutes, officially pronounced dead 6 minutes after that. In light of the rampant botching and increased attention paid to lethal injections, many states have responded by obscuring more of the process. Curtains are drawn, medical procedures are done before the execution officially starts. Inmates have even entered the execution chamber already unconscious. Last year's execution of Joe Nathan James Jr. was the longest lethal injection process yet, and indeed, the single lengthiest recorded execution in U.S. history, and yet, prison officials stated there was nothing out of the ordinary. An autopsy revealed this was an obvious lie. James' body was covered in puncture wounds, unexplained incisions, and bruising. On the day of the execution, reporters were delayed entry with 2 told they didn't meet dress code. Although the process took over 3 hours, only the last 20 minutes were visible to onlookers. As the fantasy of lethal injections' quick and painless executions has become more apparent, so too has its true appeal as a mechanism of state-sponsored death. Only the superficial barbarism of the process has been reduced, but the superficialities are the whole game. Actually delivering a humane death is far less important than presenting the appearance of one. Although we enjoy perceiving ourselves as less barbarous than previous generations, we also frequently exclude imprisoned populations from that view of society. We're the land of the free, so long as you don't count the millions that are constitutionally enslaved. And in keeping with this line of thinking, many have questioned if we need a humane method of execution at all. There is certainly malice toward prisoners here. A substantial number of people want any punishment to be actively torturous. But another significant part of the population simply doesn't want to think about it at all, and this is where lethal injection shines. The scientific near-medical lethal injection sounds good, and sounding good is the only bar it needs to clear. This opinion has been more or less stated explicitly in the Supreme Court. Justice Skrya said that in comparison to the deaths of murder victims, lethal injection looks pretty desirable, and continued to write how enviable a quiet death by lethal injection would be. It's a bit of judicial lethargy disguised as moral relativity. Skrya was probably aware that many lethal injections were not enviable deaths. I just don't think he gave a shit. Recognizing the prison system contained injustices would mean that someone would have to do work correcting them. Ironically, the stated goal of a quick and painless execution is perhaps best delivered by methods that feel most brutal. It is an admittedly shocking fact to learn that 4 states technically allow firing squads as a method of execution. It may be even more shocking to learn that Utah executed a man via firing squad as recently as 2010. And yet, statistically, firing squads provide a quicker death with fewer opportunities for error than any other method discussed. The man killed in 2010 chose to die by firing squad. In 2022, improvising after the state ran out of lethal injection drugs, South Carolina demanded a death row inmate pick a method of execution. He, too, chose the firing squad over the alternative of the electric chair. But despite these 2 cases, trends don't indicate the firing squad is really making a comeback. Its swiftness and efficacy are undercut by its complete lack of subtlety. You can pretend that a corpse killed by chemicals or electricity avoided physical trauma. It's impossible to make the same claim about a bullet hole. What might work for the condemned doesn't work for the onlooker, the same reason the guillotine has never been used in the States. The violence of the process is just too obvious. If you're a critic of the death penalty, though, you know that the barbarity of the system starts earlier and runs far deeper than solely the execution method. A broad-scale look at death row reveals an overpowering sense of randomness. There are no crimes that carry mandatory death sentences, so whether any individual person ends up facing capital punishment is hugely dependent on factors outside the scope of the crime. The state it was committed in, for example, or the sympathy of its leadership decades after the crime itself. The average person on death row has been there for almost 20 years. They could be granted clemency by a politician who wasn't even old enough to vote when the crime was committed. You can find countless examples of identical crimes landing one person on death row and another with a life sentence, random variables landing them on one side of a coin or the other. But simultaneously, looking at every variable as random is completely naive. The death penalty is shot through with racial bias and has been for as long as we've been keeping statistics on it. In decades of studies up through the present day, the overwhelming trend is that Black lives simply matter less to the justice system. Controlling for all confounding variables, cases with white victims resulted in the death penalty more than 4 times as often as Black victims. Incorporate gender, and the numbers come into even sharper relief. The murder of a white woman is 13 times more likely to result in a capital sentence than the murder of a Black man. Maybe the most striking number is 21, the vanishingly small total number of executions since 1970 for cases in which a white defendant killed a Black victim. With the races reversed, that number is more than 10 times higher, a figure completely disproportionate to the crime rates between races. And that's on top of every other level of discrimination in the justice system: jury manipulation, police misconduct, prosecutorial aggression. Earlier, I said that courts didn't want to acknowledge the US's carceral failings because it would mean they'd have to do something about it. This wasn't really me being flip. This too has been stated near explicitly by the Supreme Court. In 1987's McCleskey v. Kemp, Warren McCleskey's lawyers argued that capital punishment in Georgia demonstrated a clear pattern of racial discrimination, with similar crimes yielding significantly different sentences based on the race of the defendant and victim. The Supreme Court generally did not disagree with the statistical findings. However, they ruled that statistics alone were insufficient to demonstrate unconstitutional discrimination. Justice Powell wrote, "McCleskey's claim, taken to its logical conclusion, throws into serious question the principles that underlie our entire criminal justice system. The Eighth Amendment is not limited in application to capital punishment, but applies to all penalties. Thus, if we accepted McCleskey's claim that racial bias has impermissibly tainted the capital sentencing decision, we could soon be faced with similar claims as to other types of penalty." Throws into serious question the principles that underlie our entire criminal justice system. Yeah, dude, it does. And yet, instead of acting, the court shuts the door, because the questions raised about the implementation of capital punishment could start a chain reaction that reveals the house of cards everything is built on. Even before we get to sentencing, there's the issue of, if the accused did the crime at all. A statistic so staggering I've never been able to get it out of my head is that since the mid-1970s, 1,565 people have been executed in the United States, and in that same time, 190 people have been fully exonerated from death row. Not had their sentences reduced or pled to a lesser crime, but released from prison following proof of their innocence. Defendants of color make up a disproportionately high number of those wrongfully convicted inmates as well. You could view that exoneration rate with optimism. That, hey, the system works. Look at all those people they set free before they had to complete their deadly sentence. Or you could read it the way I do, that for every 8 people the state has executed, at least one person sentenced to die has been innocent. Those odds do not inspire faith in the system's accuracy. But after I've spent so much time on it, you might be shocked by the most important statistic of all. Capital punishment is dwindling. Both death sentences and executions have been on a downward slope for decades. 2021 had the least executions in the US in 40 years. 2022 wasn't far behind. Many states have completely barred capital punishment, others have put it on indefinite hiatus. This legislation is propped up by public opinion, which is generally experiencing similar 40-year lows in support for the death penalty and 40-year highs in opposition to it. It feels like, after a century of promising to create humane executions, we're recognizing that the barbarity runs deeper than the literal moment of death. Yes, the noose, chair, chamber, injection all have taken their turns functioning as machines to slowly and cruelly kill people, but only after the even slower machine of the American justice system has done the same. Where is the lack of barbarity in making someone spend decades on death row wondering if this is the week they die? Where is the progress, the enlightenment of contemporary society in a handful of counties selecting a handful of criminals with all the precision of a racist pachinko machine? The more light you give capital punishment, the more the entire structure bleeds with a brutality that was supposedly left in a more primitive age. The thing is, state-sponsored killing isn't exclusive to death row. And although 2021 had notably few capital punishment cases carried to their conclusion, it still managed to break a record in deadliness. 2021 saw 1,048 people killed by police, more people gunned down in a single year than have been officially executed in the 21st century. 2021 broke the previous record for police killings, set in 2020, which broke the previous record set in 2019. 2022 was the deadliest again, and virtually every source of this data also notes that the true number of police killings is almost certainly underreported. The murders by police have increased year over year despite falling crime rates with or without the presence of protests and, of course, in opposition to falling capital sentences. If the ethical discomfort with capital punishment stems from its excruciating deliberation, The years of court cases, the discoveries of conflicting evidence, the endless debates over execution method. Police killings are a nice little mental shortcut. No court case whatsoever. No uncomfortable process to bureaucratically decide what moral consequence they deserve. No chance of an exoneration, no eventual recognition of personhood, no tortured death by a machine supposed to deliver a humane one. Instead, what we have is a return to Foucault's theories of execution as a public display of an invincible force. Its aim is not so much to re-establish a balance as to bring into play as its extreme point the dissymmetry between the subject who has dared to violate the law and the all-powerful sovereign who displays his strength. And when this is the goal, any method is fair play, shooting, strangling, beating to death. Nor does the law have to conform to pre-existing written standards. When an individual becomes judge, jury, and executioner, they are the law, and can such decide when their sovereignty has been questioned, and what retribution they can respond with. This superiority is not simply that of right, but that of the physical strength of the sovereign beating down upon the body of his adversary and mastering it. The ceremony of punishment, then, is an exercise of terror. Last year, researchers mapped police killings onto the geographic history of lynchings in the United States. Wouldn't you know it, even after controlling for factors like crime levels, segregation, and socioeconomic conditions, the number of lynchings in a given county is a significant predictive factor for rates of execution by police today. Previously, I talked about the history still tied to the noose, the thousands of murders that erased the line between mob violence and legally sanctioned death sentences. But the problem was never the noose. The humanity of white supremacist lynchings couldn't have been solved if they opted for a more gentle delivery of death. The legacy of legalized murder instead presents itself most clearly in who was allowed to wield it, from the earliest slave patrols to unofficially sanctioned vigilante mobs to modern-day cops. The trick in shifting a state's violence from a collective like the justice system to theoretically individual actors like cops is pulling two contradictory moves simultaneously. The process of deciding who lives and who dies becomes more invisible. Legal precedent, evolving cultural norms, the role of everyday citizens on juries or as advocates, all of that disappears when the execution is performed at the impulse of a group immune to consequences. And yet, the power and untouchability of the state gains extreme visibility, recorded on security footage, cell phones, hell, the cops' own body cams. Does heightened visibility bring increased scrutiny? I guess. But when the results of that scrutiny are ballooning budgets and a kill count that continues to go up year after year, it feels like state violence has instead made itself inescapable. Every headline, news station, and social media inundated with the implied message that this institution can simply do whatever it wants. Late in his book, Austin Sarat writes that, for as prevalent as they are, botched executions only account for a minor amount of movement within the larger trend of the death penalty. He attributes their lack of major cultural impact to the coverage of such events. Write-ups of horrific executions treated the botchings as individual mistakes, flubs made by a single staff member. Even the repeated failures of an execution method couldn't raise the question of systemic injustice because the inherent justice of capital punishment was a foregone conclusion. Working backwards from the assumption of justice is also how we run into the narrative over and over that a murder by the cops was the right call, the only call they could have made. In a sense, it's a narrative that makes every subsequent arm of the justice system almost redundant. Why spend so much time, effort, and deliberation on this question when a third party could make all those decisions for us? Finally, we've removed ourselves from barbarity by simply delegating the barbarism to a system responsible only to itself. This video does not mark the beginning of my interest in capital punishment, nor even is it the first time I've written about it. 9 years ago, in a college course on the death penalty, I wrote an essay about the failures of lethal injection. At the time, I remember being very proud of it. I still have it saved, but haven't read it since I turned it in. Or I hadn't, until just now. Deciding whether or not to use capital punishment was only one of the choices the states had to make. The method of execution was also left to their discretion. On a new video exclusive to Nebula, you can watch me perform this essay in the same way that I do with my written work now, except this performance of it is my first time reading it in almost a decade. Then after reading, I go through and deconstruct the essay, talking about what it does well, does poorly, and how I would better format it to fit video. You have to lay so much groundwork to essentially say the one new observation you have. The essay gets to that idea too late. Nebula is a creator-owned and operated streaming service that lets me do things like this. Free of the constant pressure to only make things that suit the algorithm, Nebula allows me to revisit my old writing, or make lasagna, or fill an essay with content-necessary licensed music. And when you sign up for Nebula with my code, you're not just getting access to these videos, you're directly, monetarily supporting me. As I said in the beginning, if you want to see more essays like this, Nebula is maybe the best way to make sure I and others have a stable place to create them. My exclusive companion to this video is nearly 30 minutes long. If my college essay is great, you simply get another quality thing from me. If it hasn't held up so well, you can hear me be critical of its failings and get an insight into how I write now. And in any case, you'll be ensuring that work like this has a place to exist. I think that's as good a reason to sign up as any.